They told him to keep moving, to leave the battlefield behind. But something in the silence made Ethan Cole stop anyway. The kind of silence that didn't belong after a fight. The kind that pressed against his helmet and echoed inside his chest like a second heartbeat. The air shimmered with residual heat, carrying the sharp metallic taste of scorched circuitry. And beneath his boots the sand had fused into jagged glass that cracked with every step, his HUD flickering at the edge of vision. 43%. Power, oxygen steady, navigation offline. And for a moment he considered doing exactly what Command would expect. Walk, survive, forget. But then he saw her. She wasn't moving. Not like the others who had already been cleared by time and distance. She was still there, half buried in the reflective crust, her form outlined in faint blue light, like something the world itself hadn't decided to let go of yet. Ethan slowed, pulse syncing with the low hum of his suit, every instinct telling him this was wrong, not because she was dangerous, but because she was still here. The closer he got, the more the details sharpened, skin like liquid sapphire catching the dim twin suns, armor fractured but still clinging to her frame, eyes open, aware, not pleading, not afraid, just watching him with a stillness that felt deliberate, calculated, final. Leave. Her voice came through the translator, distorted but steady, as if the word had been prepared long before he arrived, and Ethan felt something twist in his chest, something older than orders or alliances. He glanced at the horizon, empty, then back at her, and for a second the entire world narrowed to that space between them, human and alien, enemy and survivor, logic and something else he couldn't name. You're still breathing, he muttered, more to himself than to her, kneeling despite the warning indicators blinking across his visor. And when his glove hovered near her shoulder, the readings spiked. Unknown signals, unstable energy. Patterns, something buried deeper than injury. And then it happened. Her body reacted, not violently, but sharply, like a system waking up after being forced into shutdown. A ripple of light running beneath her skin, her expression shifting just slightly, not into fear, but into confusion, as if something inside her had changed without permission. Ethan froze, heart hammering against his ribs. And for the first time since the fighting ended, he realized this wasn't just a survivor he'd found. This was something unfinished, something not meant to be left behind. And somewhere high above the haze, unseen by his failing sensors, a faint shadow moved across the sky, descending slowly, deliberately, like it had been watching the entire time. The glow beneath her skin did not fade, it steadied, pulsing in slow intervals that did not match any biological rhythm Ethan recognized. And his suit immediately flagged it as anomalous, unfamiliar. Something not meant to restart once it had begun shutting down. He pulled his hand back instinctively, the servos in his glove whining softly, as if even the machine hesitated, and for a moment neither of them moved, the battlefield stretching silent around them like the aftermath of a storm that had decided not to return. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice different now, not weaker, but uncertain in a way that did not belong to a warrior, and Ethan frowned behind his visor, scanning her. Readings again, watching as lines of alien script attempted to translate themselves into something his system could understand, failing again and again. "I did not do anything," he said slowly, shifting his weight as a gust of cold wind dragged fine particles across the glass surface, tapping against his armor like distant static. "I just did not leave." And that answer seemed to affect her more than any direct action could have, her gaze locking onto him with a sharp intensity that carried no hostility, only confusion, as if the concept itself was foreign. Her fingers twitched slightly against the hardened sand, not reaching for a weapon, not bracing for impact, but testing, feeling, as though sensation itself had returned without warning. Ethan noticed the subtle change immediately, the way her breathing altered, the way her shoulders tensed not in defense, but in awareness. And something about that made the tightness in his chest grow heavier. "You should not be here," she said. After a moment, the translator catching every syllable with mechanical precision, yet unable to hide the faint shift in tone. "My kind does not get recovered once we are left behind." And Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, glancing once more toward the horizon where nothing moved. No rescue signals, no returning units, just an empty stretch of sky that felt too wide, too indifferent. Yeah, he replied quietly, adjusting the pack on his back, already calculating weight distribution without fully committing to the decision. Mine does. And before he could second-guess himself, he reached forward again, this time more carefully, sliding an arm beneath her shoulders, the contact sending another ripple of light across her skin, brighter now, more defined, and her body reacted instantly, not with resistance, but with something closer to alarm. Her breath caught, sharp and uneven, and she stared at him as if he had just crossed a boundary that could not be undone. "Stop," she whispered, not as an order, but as a plea she did not fully understand, and Ethan froze mid-motion, his muscles locking despite the urgency building in the back of his mind. "What is wrong?" he asked, his voice lower now, steadier, the way he used to speak to civilians back when things were simpler. And she shook her head slightly, eyes unfocused for a fraction of a second, before snapping back to him. "There is interference," she said, searching for the word as if it did not belong to her language. "Something is changing." And Ethan followed her gaze instinctively, looking up through the cracked sky where the light had dimmed just enough to reveal movement, distant but unmistakable, a shadow growing larger against the fading glow, descending with quiet precision. And for the first time since he had stopped walking, Ethan realized they were no longer alone. The shadow grew larger with unnatural steadiness, not drifting like debris or falling like wreckage, but descending with intention, and Ethan felt the hairs along the back of his neck rise even inside the sealed environment of his suit, as his HUD struggled to identify the incoming object, cycling through classifications and returning nothing but warnings. Lyra followed his gaze, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly as the light beneath her skin intensified again, pulsing faster now, almost in response to whatever was approaching from above. And for the first time since he had found her, there was something unmistakable in her expression that had not been there before, not pride, not defiance, but uncertainty. "They have come for me," she said, her voice quieter, as if the certainty she expected did not arrive with the statement. And Ethan shifted his stance, instinctively placing himself between her and the open sky even though he had no clear plan for what he would do next. "Are they your people?" he asked, adjusting his grip slightly beneath her shoulders, the weight unfamiliar but manageable, his suit compensating with a soft mechanical hum. And Lyra hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the descending silhouette. "They are what remains of them," she answered, the translator catching a subtle hesitation that made the words feel incomplete. The object above broke through the thin haze of the atmosphere, revealing smooth, angular lines that reflected no light, a surface that seemed to absorb it instead. And Ethan's sensors spiked again, interference flooding his display as static crawled across his vision. "That does not look like a rescue," he muttered, taking a slow step backward, boots grinding against the glass terrain as he tested the ground behind him, already mapping a route in his mind toward the half-collapsed structures he had passed earlier. Lyra's hand moved then, not toward him, not away, but hovering uncertainly between, as if she was trying to decide what instinct to follow. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a strain that did not belong to a trained warrior. "If they retrieve me, I will not remain as I am." And Ethan glanced down at her sharply, catching the shift in her breathing, the way her body tensed not against pain but against the idea itself. "Meaning what?" he pressed, his tone firmer now, and she closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, as if searching through something deeper than memory. "Meaning what you have awakened will be removed," she said, and the words hung between them heavier than anything else in the silent field. Ethan looked back at the descending craft, then at her, then back again, the calculation in his mind shifting rapidly from survival to something far less defined, and for a brief moment, he considered the simplest option, placing her back down, stepping away, letting the situation resolve itself the way the universe clearly intended. But the thought did not settle. It did not anchor the way logic usually did. Instead, it felt wrong, incomplete, like leaving a sentence unfinished. "Can you move?" he asked abruptly, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. And Lyra shook her head slightly, her glowing skin dimming just enough to reveal the strain beneath. "Not without assistance," she admitted. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound loud inside his helmet, before tightening his grip and lifting her fully from the ground. Her body reacted again, that ripple of light spreading faster this time, her breath catching sharply as she stared at him in disbelief. "Human, do not," she began. But he cut her off with a quiet, steady response. "Too late," and turned toward the distant ruins just as a low, resonant hum rolled across the battlefield from above, deep enough to be felt more than heard, vibrating through the air, the ground, and straight into his chest. And something about that sound told him this was no longer about who had won or lost, but about what he was about to refuse to give back. The first step nearly threw him off balance, not because of her weight, but because of the sudden shift in everything around him. The air itself vibrating with that low, resonant hum as the descending craft pressed closer, its presence bending the silence into something dense and heavy. And Ethan forced his legs to move, boots grinding against fractured glass as he angled toward the distant ruins, each step deliberate, controlled, his suit compensating, but warning lights flickering at the edge of his vision. Lyra's body remained tense in his arms, not resisting but not settling either, as if every instinct she had was being rewritten in real time, and the glow beneath her skin pulsed in uneven intervals now, no longer steady, no longer predictable, matching neither the rhythm of a machine nor the calm precision of a trained warrior. "You do not understand what you are doing," she said, her voice closer to him now, less distant, less certain, and Ethan kept his eyes forward, scanning the terrain ahead, measuring distance in quick mental calculations. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "That makes two of us." And there was no humor in it, only a strange steadiness that surprised even him. The ruins loomed larger with every step, a broken structure half sunken into the hardened sand, jagged edges casting long shadows that offered the first real cover he had seen since he stopped walking. And behind them, the hum deepened, shifting into something more focused, more directed, like a tension locking onto a target. His HUD spiked again, interference crawling across the display in sharp bursts, briefly distorting his vision before stabilizing just enough to keep moving. And he adjusted his grip on Lyra, pulling her closer instinctively as another ripple of light passed through her, brighter this time, almost blinding against the dim sky. She inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening against the fabric of his suit for the first time, not in aggression but in reaction, and the contact sent a subtle tremor through him that had nothing to do with fear. "It hurts," she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could restrain them, and Ethan slowed. For half a second, glancing down at her, catching the unfamiliar strain in her expression, something raw, unfiltered, and entirely out of place for someone who had faced a battlefield without hesitation. "What does?" he asked, his voice lower now, more focused, and she blinked, as if trying to isolate the sensation itself. "Everything," she answered, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have. Ethan swallowed, the metallic taste in his mouth returning as he pushed forward again, closing the last stretch of distance to the ruins, stepping over collapsed sections of structure and ducking beneath a partially intact frame that still held against gravity through some forgotten engineering. Inside, the air shifted, cooler, quieter, the hum outside dampened but not gone, a constant reminder that whatever was above them had not lost interest. He lowered her carefully onto a relatively stable surface, the material cold and smooth beneath his gloves, and for a moment he simply stayed there, one hand still bracing her shoulder as if letting go too soon might undo something he did not fully understand. Lyra's glow dimmed slightly in the shadowed space, but it did not disappear, instead settling into a softer, more erratic pulse, and she looked at him again, really looked this time, not as an enemy, not as a variable in a calculation, but as something she could not categorize. "Why?" she asked, the word quieter than before, almost fragile, and Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as he glanced toward the fractured entrance where faint light still filtered through. "Because leaving you there felt wrong," he said, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to affect her more than anything else he had done. Outside, the hum shifted again, lower, closer, and a thin beam of pale light cut across the opening of the ruins, sweeping slowly across the ground. Like something searching, and Ethan's body went still, every instinct sharpening as he realized they had just been found. The beam did not flicker or hesitate. It moved with slow precision across the fractured floor, pale light bending around broken edges, as if the structure itself could not fully block it, and Ethan felt his breath steady instinctively, every muscle locking into a stillness that came from training, not fear. As he lowered himself slightly beside Lyra, keeping his profile small, controlled, the hum outside pressing against the walls like a distant engine that refused to leave. The light swept closer, inch by inch, illuminating dust suspended in the air, tiny particles drifting like frozen time. And for a moment Ethan could hear nothing but the quiet rhythm of his own heartbeat echoing inside his helmet, loud enough to feel, steady enough to focus on. Lyra did not move, but he could sense the tension in her, the subtle shift in her breathing, the faint tremor in her fingers as they rested against the cold surface beneath her. And when the edge of the beam reached them, her glow reacted instantly, flaring brighter in response, not by choice but by design, like something inside her answering a call she did not want to hear. "It is searching for me," she whispered, the words barely carried by the translator, and Ethan clenched his jaw, watching as the light hovered just a few inches away, scanning, analyzing, then shifting slightly as if recalibrating. His HUD struggled to process it, symbols glitching, warnings stacking without resolution. But one thing was clear, whatever controlled that beam was not guessing. It knew exactly what it was looking for. Ethan's gaze moved quickly, mapping the interior, broken panels, collapsed sections, narrow angles where light struggled to reach, and without thinking further he reached for a loose fragment of plating nearby, dragging it slowly, carefully, positioning it between Lyra and the incoming beam, each movement deliberate, measured, the metal scraping softly against the glassed floor. The beam paused, almost imperceptibly, then shifted again, brushing against the edge of the barrier he had created, its glow diffusing just enough to obscure what lay behind it. Lyra's breathing hitched again, sharper this time, her eyes closing briefly as if resisting something internal, something pulling at her from within, and Ethan leaned closer. His voice low, steady. "Stay with me," he said, not fully understanding why those words felt necessary but knowing they were. Her eyes opened again, locking onto his, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in them. Not confusion, not calculation, but awareness, fragile and new. "It is trying to take it back," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray the strain. "What you gave me." And Ethan shook his head slightly, almost instinctively. "I did not give you anything," he replied, but even as he said it, he knew that was not entirely true. Outside, the hum deepened, shifting into a sharper tone that vibrated through the structure, and the beam intensified, widening slightly, pressing harder against the barrier, light bleeding through the edges in thin strands that reached toward her like searching fingers. Ethan's grip tightened on the metal, holding it in place despite the vibration, his muscles straining against the subtle force pressing inward. And for a brief second, he wondered how long he could hold this position, how long before whatever was above decided to escalate. Lyra turned her head slightly, her gaze moving past him toward the fractured opening, and her voice came quieter now, almost resigned. "If they take me, it will end," she said, and Ethan followed her gaze, watching the shifting light, the endless scanning, the patience of something that did not tire, did not doubt. He exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, deliberate, and then he said something he had not planned, something that settled into place the moment it left his mouth. "Then they are not taking you." And the words hung there, simple, absolute, as the beam pulsed brighter in response, as if the sky itself had heard him and disagreed. The light did not retreat when he spoke. It sharpened, narrowing into a thinner, more concentrated line that cut along the edges of the metal plate as if testing its limits. And Ethan felt the vibration intensify through his gloves, a steady pressure that was no longer searching but insisting. His HUD flickered again, power dipping to 41%, warning icons stacking in the corner of his vision, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the rhythm of his breathing, slow, controlled, the way he had been trained to hold steady when everything else started to move. Beside him, Lyra's glow surged again, brighter than before, her entire form outlined in A faint, shifting blue that pulsed against the dim interior, and her hand moved, this time finding his forearm, gripping it with a strength that surprised him, not aggressive, not defensive, but anchoring. "It is reacting to you," she said, her voice strained, every word carrying a weight she was not used to feeling, and Ethan glanced down briefly, meeting her gaze, seeing something in her eyes that had not been there minutes ago. Not just awareness, but fear, raw and unfiltered, and that alone told him more than any scanner reading could. "Good," he replied quietly, turning his attention back to the beam. "Then it can react all at once." And the moment the words settled, the hum outside shifted again, deeper, more focused, like something adjusting its approach. The beam expanded suddenly, not violently but with purpose, widening just enough to spill around the barrier in thin strands of light that reached across the floor in slow arcs, illuminating the space in fragments. And Ethan adjusted the plate again, angling it, blocking what he could. But the movement drew more attention, the light following the shift with precise correction. "It will not stop," Lyra said, her voice softer now, almost resigned again, and Ethan shook his head slightly, his jaw tightening as he scanned the structure around them. Broken consoles lining the far wall, remnants of old systems half buried beneath dust and time. Cables hanging loose like veins disconnected from a forgotten body. Something in his training clicked into place then, not a plan, not fully, but a direction, and he shifted his weight, carefully lowering the metal plate just enough to keep partial cover before reaching toward one of the exposed panels with his free hand. His fingers brushed against cold surfaces, cracked interfaces, and for a moment nothing responded, just silence and dust, until a faint flicker of dormant energy pulsed beneath the surface. "Weak but present. Stay with me," he said again, more firmly. This time, not looking at her as he began to manipulate the panel, forcing connections, rerouting what little power remained in the ancient system, and Lyra's grip tightened slightly in response, her breathing uneven but steady enough to hold. Outside, the beam intensified again, light spilling further into the structure, reaching across the floor in long, searching lines, and Ethan felt the pressure build, time narrowing into a thin, fragile window. The panel sparked faintly beneath his touch, systems waking in fragments, incomplete but alive, and a low, different hum began to rise from within the ruins themselves, separate from the one above, older, quieter, but real. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, sensing the shift, and she turned her head toward the sound, confusion mixing with something else, something almost like hope. "What are you doing?" she asked, and Ethan exhaled slowly, a small breath that carried more weight than he expected. "Buying us time," he answered, and as the internal systems flickered to life in broken pulses, the beam outside hesitated for the first time, just a fraction, just enough to prove it could be distracted, and in that brief, fragile moment, Ethan realized that whatever was hunting them was not unstoppable. It was just very, very patient. The hesitation in the beam was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Ethan felt it like a shift in pressure, like the moment before a storm decides where to break, and he leaned into it, fingers moving faster across the cracked interface as he forced more of the ancient system awake. The panel flickering with uneven light, fragments of data stuttering across a display that had not been used in years. The low hum inside the structure grew steadier, still weak but present, threading through the walls like a second heartbeat that did not belong to the sky above. And for the first time since the beam had found them, the air felt less controlled, less owned by whatever was searching. Lyra's grip on his arm loosened slightly, not because the tension had faded, but because her attention had shifted, her head turning slowly as she tried to understand the new sensation around her, the faint vibrations beneath her, the difference between the force outside and the fragile life returning inside. "This place, it is responding," she said, her voice quieter now, almost cautious. And Ethan gave a small nod, even though he was not looking at her. His focus locked on the panel as he rerouted another damaged connection, sparks flickering briefly before stabilizing into a dim, steady glow. "Yeah," he replied under his breath. "It just needed a push." And as if answering him, a faint line of light traced along the interior wall, not bright, not aggressive, just enough to mark the outline of a system waking up, piece by broken piece. Outside, the beam shifted again, narrowing slightly as if reassessing, its edges pulling back just enough to concentrate on a smaller area. And Ethan noticed the change immediately. The way the light no longer swept aimlessly but focused, adapting, learning. It is adjusting, Lyra said, her voice carrying a hint of urgency again, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders tightening as he braced against the console. Then we adjust faster, he answered, pushing the panel harder, forcing more power through circuits that were never meant to carry it anymore. The hum inside the ruins deepened, gaining strength, and a section of the ceiling above them flickered faintly, casting a weak, uneven glow that disrupted the beam's path, scattering it just enough to create pockets of shadow where there had been none before. Ethan's eyes tracked the change instantly, mapping the new cover, the new angles, and for the first time since he had stepped into the ruins, he saw something he could work with, not just survival, but movement. Lyra shifted slightly, testing her balance against the surface beneath her, her movements still limited but more deliberate now, as if her body was relearning itself in real time. And when she looked back at him, there was something steadier in her gaze, something that had not been there when he found her in the open field. You are interfering with its retrieval, she said, not as a warning but as a realization, and Ethan gave a small, almost absent nod. That is kind of the idea, he replied, and for a brief second, something like disbelief flickered across her expression, not at the situation, but at him. The beam outside pulsed again, brighter, more focused, its light pressing against the fractured entrance with renewed intensity. But this time it did not dominate the space completely, the scattered illumination from within pushing back just enough to break its control, to fragment its reach. Ethan pushed himself up from the panel, rolling his shoulders as his suit adjusted, the servos responding with a quiet whine, and he glanced toward the deeper sections of the ruins, darker, less exposed, a path that had not existed before the system came back to life. Can you hold on? He asked, turning back to Lyra, his voice steady despite the pressure building around them, and she met his gaze without hesitation this time, her answer immediate, certain in a way it had not been before. Yes. And as the beam surged again at the entrance, searching harder, more aggressively, Ethan reached for her once more, knowing that the next move would decide whether the light outside remained a threat or became something they could finally leave behind. The moment she answered, Ethan did not hesitate. He slid his arm beneath her again and lifted, smoother this time, more certain, his body already adjusting to the motion as if it had learned her weight, her balance, the way she shifted without realizing it. And Lyra reacted differently now, not with that sharp, startled tension from before, but with a controlled inhale, her hand gripping his shoulder instead of pushing away, anchoring herself as the faint glow beneath her skin steadied into a more consistent rhythm. The interior lights flickered again, casting fractured patterns across the walls as Ethan turned toward the deeper corridor, each step deliberate as he moved. Away from the entrance, away from the beam that still pressed against the opening like something unwilling to let go. The hum inside the ruins guided him now, subtle but present, leading deeper into the structure where the light from outside struggled to reach, and behind them the beams surged again, sweeping wider, faster, its edges no longer patient but probing with sharper intent. It will not lose track of me, Lyra said, her voice close to his ear, steady but threaded with something new, something that sounded dangerously close to worry, and Ethan tightened his grip slightly, adjusting her position as he stepped over a collapsed section of flooring, the glass beneath his boots crunching softly. Then we make it harder, he replied, his eyes scanning ahead, mapping the narrow passage where the internal lights flickered just enough to create a shifting maze of shadows. The corridor bent sharply to the left, the walls narrowing, forcing him to turn his body sideways to pass through, his shoulder brushing against cold metal that hummed faintly with returning power, and Lyra's glow reflected off the surface in soft pulses, illuminating their path in brief flashes. Your systems, she said after a moment, her gaze flickering toward the faint display on his arm. They are failing. And Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it carried any humor. Yeah, they are doing that, he answered, glancing down briefly at the blinking indicators. Power now at 39%, fluctuations increasing as interference from above seeped deeper into the structure. "You should leave me," she added, the words coming faster this time, more urgent, but lacking the cold certainty from before, and Ethan shook his head immediately, not even considering it. "No," he said simply, and the weight of that single word settled between them heavier than anything else. Behind them, the beam forced its way further into the ruins, not as a single line now, but splitting into multiple strands that traced along the walls, following heat signatures, energy fluctuations, anything that could guide it closer, and Ethan felt the shift in the air, the pressure building again as if the structure itself was being scanned layer by layer. The corridor opened slightly ahead, revealing a wider chamber with partially intact systems lining the walls, their faint glow stronger here, more stable, and for a brief moment Ethan slowed, taking it in, calculating options, paths, anything that could give them more distance. Lyra turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the room with a focus that had returned in a different form, not the cold calculation of before, but something more adaptive, more alive. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a clarity that had not been there when he first found her. "This place can hide us," she said, and Ethan nodded once, already moving toward the far side of the chamber where the shadows pooled deeper, thicker, the internal light struggling to reach. The beam reached the corridor entrance behind them, splitting again, probing into the space they had just left, and for a moment it hesitated, its path disrupted by the shifting illumination and the growing complexity of the environment, and Ethan felt it, that brief uncertainty, that tiny fracture in its control. He did not look back, did not slow, just kept moving forward into the deeper dark, carrying her with him as the ruins around them continued to wake, piece by fragile piece, and for the first time since the sky had started watching, the distance between them and the light began to grow. The deeper chamber held a different kind of silence, not empty like the battlefield but layered, filled with the faint hum of systems that were remembering how to function, and Ethan slowed just enough to let his eyes adjust, the dim interior light casting long shadows across consoles that flickered with intermittent life. The air felt cooler here, less charged by the presence above, and for a moment the pressure in his chest eased, not gone but distant, like a storm moving just beyond the horizon. Lyra shifted slightly in his arms, her breathing steadier now, her grip on his shoulder firm but controlled, and the glow beneath her skin settled into a softer rhythm that illuminated the edges of the room in gentle pulses. "This place was not meant for war," she said quietly, her gaze moving across the structures around them, as if recognizing something beyond the physical, and Ethan glanced at the nearest panel, its surface etched with unfamiliar symbols that pulsed faintly in response to her presence. "What was it meant for?" he asked, lowering her carefully onto a stable platform near the wall, one that still hummed with a low, consistent energy, and she hesitated, her expression tightening as if the answer was just out of reach. "Preservation," she said finally, the word carrying a weight that felt older than the conflict outside. Ethan leaned back slightly, scanning the room, noting the arrangement of the consoles, the symmetry in their placement, the way the light seemed to concentrate around certain points as if guiding attention, and something about it shifted his understanding. This was not just a shelter, it was a system designed to protect something, or someone, behind them. Faint strands of the searching light reached the edge of the chamber, weaker now, fragmented by the layers of structure and the growing interference from within, and Ethan felt the difference immediately. The way the pressure no longer pressed directly against him, but scattered across the space, diluted. "It is losing clarity," Lyra said, her voice steadier, more certain, and Ethan gave a small nod, stepping toward a central console that flickered brighter than the rest, its surface responding faintly as he approached, the light shifting in subtle patterns that almost felt intentional. His hand hovered over it for a second before making contact, and the response was immediate, a soft surge of energy that traveled through the panel, causing nearby systems to stabilize, their glow strengthening just enough to push the shadows back further. Lyra watched him closely, her eyes tracking every movement. And there was something in her expression now that had not been there before. Not confusion, not fear, but recognition, not of him, but of what he was doing. "You are activating it," she said, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers moving across the interface, guided more by instinct than understanding. "I am trying," he corrected, and the system responded again, a low tone resonating through the chamber, deeper than the hum, more structured, like a signal being formed. Outside, the beam flickered briefly, its strands retracting slightly as if recalibrating, and for the first time since it had found them, it did not immediately push forward again. Ethan noticed the shift, the way the light hesitated at the edge of the chamber, no longer advancing with the same certainty, and a realization settled in quietly. This place was not just hiding them, it was interfering. Lyra drew in a slow breath, her shoulders easing just a fraction as the pressure around them lessened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something steadier. "It cannot see me clearly anymore," she said, and Ethan allowed himself a small pause, just long enough to take that in before continuing his work, because whatever this place was, whatever it had been designed to protect, it was now doing the same for them. And somewhere beyond the walls, the sky continued to search, but for the first time, it was no longer certain where to look. The tone from the console deepened into a steady resonance that seemed to settle into the bones of the structure, and Ethan felt it through his boots, a subtle vibration that carried intention rather than noise, as if the place itself had decided to remain awake. The flickering lights stabilized further, casting a more consistent glow across the chamber, and the shadows that once shifted unpredictably now held their shape, creating a fragile sense of order in a world that had been anything but. Ethan kept his hand on the interface, eyes scanning the evolving patterns, watching as unfamiliar symbols aligned into repeating sequences that suggested function, not chaos. And for the first time since he had touched the panel, he felt less like he was forcing it and more like he was following something that already existed. Behind him, Lyra exhaled slowly, her posture easing as the pressure from outside diminished further, and when she looked at him, now, there was no trace of the distant detachment he had first seen on the battlefield, only a focused awareness that felt almost human in its intensity. "This system recognizes you," she said, her voice low but clear, and Ethan frowned slightly, glancing down at his hand where it rested against the surface. "I doubt that," he replied, but even as he said it, the panel pulsed again in response, light shifting outward in soft waves that spread across the surrounding consoles. The hum above them changed in answer, no longer searching in wide arcs but concentrating in narrower bands, probing the structure with increased precision, and Ethan felt the shift immediately, the way the pressure returned, not stronger but sharper, more deliberate. "It is adapting," Lyra said, her gaze lifting toward the ceiling as if she could see through the layers of metal and stone, and Ethan nodded once, already adjusting his stance, his mind running through possibilities faster than his hands could follow. "So are we," he answered, his voice steady despite the tightening space around them, and he moved along the console, tracing the patterns as they evolved, searching for something more than just interference, something that could give them an advantage beyond hiding. The system responded again, deeper this time, a sequence of tones rising and falling in structured intervals, and a section of the far wall shifted slightly, not opening fully but revealing a narrow passage that had been concealed beneath layers of inactive material. Ethan's eyes locked onto it instantly, recognizing the opportunity before the thought fully formed, and he turned toward Lyra, his expression focused, resolved. "Can you hold on a little longer?" he asked, already moving toward her, and she met his gaze without hesitation, the faint glow beneath her skin steady, controlled. "I am not the same as before," she said, and there was no pride in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of change. Ethan gave a small nod, sliding his arm beneath her once more, lifting her with a practiced motion that no longer felt uncertain. And as he did, the system around them pulsed again, brighter, stronger, as if responding not just to his actions, but to something shared between them. The beam above intensified in response, a thin line of light piercing deeper into the structure, searching with renewed focus, but when it reached the edge of the chamber, it faltered, its clarity disrupted by the overlapping signals, the interference no longer random but organized. Ethan moved toward the newly revealed passage without looking back, each step measured, controlled, his body aligning with the rhythm of the structure around him. and Lyra remained steady in his arms, her presence no longer a weight to carry but something that anchored him in return. Behind them, the beam lingered at the threshold, its light flickering with uncertainty, and, for the first time since it had descended from the sky, it did not immediately follow, as if the line between what it could see and what it could not had finally been drawn, and Ethan crossed that line without hesitation, stepping into the narrow passage where the light could not reach. The passage narrowed around them, forcing Ethan to slow his pace, each step deliberate as the walls closed in with quiet precision. The air cooler here, thinner, carrying a faint metallic scent that reminded him of systems long abandoned but not entirely dead. And the moment he crossed fully into the corridor, the hum from above dulled to a distant echo, no longer pressing directly against his senses. Behind him, the faint glow from the chamber receded, replaced by a softer, more controlled illumination embedded within the passage itself. Think a titan of light tracing along the walls like veins, pulsing in slow, synchronized patterns that matched the rhythm of the system he had awakened. Lyra shifted slightly in his arms, her breathing steady now, her earlier strain replaced by a focused calm that felt earned rather than given. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "It cannot follow us here," she said, not as a guess, but as a realization forming in real time. And Ethan nodded once, though his eyes remained forward, scanning the path ahead for any sign of instability. "Then we keep moving," he replied, his tone low, measured, and the words felt less like a decision and more like a continuation of something already set in motion. The corridor curved gradually, leading deeper into the structure, and as they moved, the light along the walls grew stronger, more consistent, revealing surfaces that were smoother, less damaged than the outer sections, as if this part of the facility had been preserved more carefully, intentionally. Ethan adjusted his grip slightly, shifting Lyra's weight with practiced ease, and she responded without hesitation, her hand resting against his shoulder in a steady hold that no longer trembled. "You are changing its behavior," she said after a moment, her gaze drifting along the glowing lines that surrounded them, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, considering that before answering. "Maybe it is changing both of us," he said, and the simplicity of it lingered between them, not needing further explanation. The system responded again, a deeper tone resonating through the passage, and a section of the wall ahead shifted subtly, revealing another chamber beyond, smaller but more contained, its light steady and warm compared to the flickering instability of the outer areas. Ethan stepped into it without hesitation, lowering Lyra carefully onto a raised surface that seemed designed for support, its structure adjusting slightly beneath her weight as if recognizing her presence. The moment she made contact, the light beneath her skin reacted again, not flaring like before, but harmonizing with the environment, her glow syncing with the soft pulses of the room, and her breath caught for just a second, not in pain, but in something closer to realization. "This place, it was meant to hold us," she said, her voice softer now, and Ethan stepped back slightly, giving her space while keeping his attention on the surrounding systems, noting how they stabilized further in response to her presence. The hum above was almost gone now, reduced to a faint vibration that barely reached them, and for the first time since he had stopped on the battlefield, Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the possibility of it. He glanced toward the passage they had come through, half expecting the light to follow, to force its way in despite everything. But it did not. It remained distant, uncertain, as if the boundary they had crossed was not just physical, but something deeper. Lyra turned her head slightly, her eyes finding his again, and there was no confusion in them now, only a quiet, steady awareness that felt new and fragile at the same time. "Why did you not leave me?" she asked again. But this time the question carried no accusation, only a need to understand, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment before answering, his voice calm, grounded. "Because you were still there." And the answer settled into the space between them, simple, unchanging, as the system around them continued to stabilize, as if it had been waiting for that choice all along. The room held steady around them, the light no longer flickering but breathing in slow, deliberate pulses that matched the rhythm beneath Lyra's skin, and Ethan found himself watching that pattern without meaning to. The way it rose and fell like something alive rather than mechanical, the hum that had once pressed down from the sky was now little more than a distant echo, but it had not disappeared. It lingered at the edge of perception, patient, waiting, and that alone kept him from relaxing fully. Lyra shifted slightly against the surface beneath her, her posture more upright now, supported by the structure as if it had been designed for her form specifically, and when she moved, the system responded in kind, light adjusting, subtle tones resonating in quiet acknowledgement. "It is stabilizing me," she said, her voice calm but layered with something deeper, something she was still learning to name, and Ethan nodded once, stepping closer to the nearest panel, his eyes scanning the interface as new sequences formed, clearer now, less fragmented, as if the system had decided to communicate rather than simply react. "Good," he said, though his tone carried more caution than relief, because he could feel the shift beyond the walls. The way the presence above had not withdrawn but repositioned, the panel before him brightened slightly under his touch, symbols aligning into structured lines that his suit struggled to translate. But the pattern was unmistakable, not random, not defensive, but purposeful. Lyra turned her head toward it, her eyes narrowing slightly as recognition flickered across her expression, not full understanding, but something close enough to matter. "It is not only preserving," she said slowly. "It is evaluating." And Ethan exhaled through his nose, that word settling, heavier than he expected. "Evaluating what?" he asked, his voice lower now, and Lyra hesitated, her gaze shifting between the panel and him. "Us," she answered, and the simplicity of it sent a quiet tension through the room that no amount of light could soften. Outside, the faint vibration grew slightly stronger, not an attack, not a surge, but a measured adjustment, and Ethan felt it through the floor beneath his boots. A reminder that whatever was above had not given up, it was waiting for a change. The system responded immediately, light intensifying just enough to push back against that external pressure, not aggressively, but with quiet resistance, as if reinforcing a boundary that had only just been established. Ethan stepped back from the panel, his eyes moving across the chamber, taking in the symmetry, the design, the way every element seemed to serve a single purpose. Not shelter alone, but something more selective, something that chose what it protected. "You said they would take it back," he said, turning toward Lyra again, his expression focused. "What exactly would they remove?" And she met his gaze without hesitation now, her voice steady, grounded in a way that felt entirely new. "Everything that is not necessary for function," she said, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of that answer settling into the space between them. Ethan glanced down at his hands, then back at her, then toward the faint glow of the panel, and something in him aligned with a clarity that did not come from training or orders, but from something simpler, something human. "Then we do not let them decide what is necessary," he said quietly, and the moment the words left him, the system responded again, a deeper tone resonating through the chamber, stronger than before, and Lyra's glow surged in harmony with it, not uncontrolled but deliberate, as if something inside her had chosen to remain. The vibration from above paused. For the briefest moment, just enough to be felt, just enough to matter, and in that silence, Ethan realized that whatever this place was, it was not just protecting them from what was outside, it was protecting what they had become inside, and that made it far more important than survival alone. The tone that filled the chamber did not fade this time. It deepened, resonating through every surface with a quiet authority that felt final. And Ethan stood still for a moment, feeling it settle into his chest, into the rhythm of his breathing, as if the structure itself had reached a decision. The faint vibration from above shifted again, not stronger, not weaker, but different, no longer probing blindly but holding at the boundary, as though whatever waited in the sky had encountered something it could not immediately resolve. Lyra's glow steadied completely, no longer pulsing in uncertainty but flowing in a smooth, continuous light that matched the system around her. And when she moved, it was with a control that had not been there before, her posture upright, supported not just by the surface beneath her, but by something internal that had finally aligned. "They are still there," she said quietly, her gaze lifting toward the unseen ceiling. and Ethan followed her line of sight even though there was nothing to see. Only the weight of presence lingering beyond reach. Yeah, he answered, his voice calm, grounded. But they are not coming in. And for the first time since this had begun, that statement felt less like defiance and more like fact. The panel behind him responded again, its light intensifying into a clear sequence, symbols aligning into a pattern that even his limited translation could begin to parse. Not language in the way he understood it, but intention, selection. Confirmation. Lyra turned her head toward it, her eyes narrowing slightly as understanding finally caught up with instinct, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. "It has chosen," she said, and Ethan glanced at her, then back at the panel, feeling the weight of that realization settle into place. "Chosen what?" he asked, though part of him already knew, and she held his gaze for a long second before answering. "Not to return me." And the words did not sound like relief. They sounded like something deeper, something irreversible. The hum above shifted once more, softer now, receding not in retreat but in acceptance, the pressure lifting just enough to be felt, and the absence of it left a space that Ethan had not realized was being occupied until it was gone. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt different, lighter, as if something he had been bracing against had finally stepped back. Lyra looked down at her hands, the light beneath her skin steady and warm, no longer reacting but existing, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. This was not supposed to happen, and Ethan gave a small, almost absent nod, his gaze moving across the chamber, taking in the quiet stability of it, the way everything had settled into place around them. "Yeah," he said softly, "most things that matter do not," and the simplicity of it lingered in the air between them, not needing anything more. The system responded one final time, a low, sustained tone that echoed through the room like a closing note, and the light around them softened, not dimming but settling into a calm, steady presence that no longer demanded attention. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, rolling his shoulders as the tension finally eased from his body, and he glanced back toward the passage they had come through, half expecting something to change, something to break the stillness, but nothing did. Lyra followed his gaze, then looked back at him, her eyes clear, steady, and filled with something that did not need translation. "What happens now?" she asked, and Ethan paused for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because for the first time in a long while, the answer was not dictated by orders, by survival, or by anything outside of that room. He met her gaze, his voice quiet but certain. "Now," he said, "we decide," and the words settled into the silence like something that had been waiting to be spoken, as the world beyond the walls continued on without them, and for the first time, that felt like it was exactly how it should be.